Thank you for agreeing to join us on Africa No Filter's webinar, Another Scramble for Africa, Unpacking Narratives on Business in Africa. And I'm joined by a phenomenal group of people, and I would like to introduce them, beginning with Bogolo Kenewendo, as former Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry in Botswana, and an African economist. Yasmin Kumi, founder and chief executive of Accra-based Africa Foresight Group, the first and largest network of freelance management consultants, and Richard Addy, co-founder of ACAS, an award-winning international consultancy, and also the author of the report. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. We are going to now begin with Richard taking us through some brief highlights of Africa No Filter's report on business in Africa. Business in Africa and the narratives that exist around the same. Richard, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Natasha. Thank you so much. I'll begin by sharing the screen and the presentation.
Please do. Please do.
Okay, can we all see the screen here?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much again, Natasha, and thank you for the other distinguished panelists, and thank you for everyone who's attending this session. So, one of the things that Africa No Filter wanted us to do was to really have a very deep understanding of the stories, narratives, and frames that were dominating business in Africa, the business in Africa narrative. And what we found, there were 7 frames through using a whole range of research approaches. So we used an online database called GDELT that covers, and at the moment, nearly 800 million stories since 2017. We did a content analysis. We looked at Twitter and social media behavior, looked at surveys, literature research, and also looked at indices of performance globally and in Africa. And we unearthed a number of frames that are really powerful. The first was what we call a more negative coverage internationally. So we found that international online news was much more likely to have a negative tone about business in Africa stories. We also found, and very shockingly, that in international online news coverage, 70% of the stories had a foreign power dimension, i.e. they mentioned either United States, United Kingdom, China, or Russia. We also found that Africa, in stories which had business in Africa in them, South Africa and Nigeria tended to dominate coverage, with up to 50%, 40 to 50% of stories referencing those two countries. In terms of the sectors that were covered, and the good news is that technology was covered reasonably well, both in African media and in international media. And actually the tone was very positive in terms of the opportunities around technology. But sadly, those creative businesses, film, fashion, art, were very rarely covered in Africa business stories. In fact, we found only 1% of them referenced those creative industries. When it came to young people and women, who arguably are incredibly important, in pure numbers term, they represent 75% of the African publics, we found very low coverage around gender equality issues, and only 8% of stories linked to young people. In terms of government policy and regulations, that dominated a lot of the narrative, often much more so than the coverage of entrepreneurs and startups. And one particularly shocking finding was around the African continental free trade area, which had very limited coverage. Now, one of the things that's come through since we published the report is a sense of, not that we don't believe these figures, but why is this happening? So we thought we'd use some real life recent examples. I'm going to focus on 2 areas. First is around the foreign powers scramble for Africa narrative. That's where we found that up until 2021, 70% of stories that were covered by international media focused on foreign powers. And we're worried that this situation is going to become even more entrenched given the international developments around Ukraine and Russia. And we've got some examples here just from the last month. We've got Voice of America talks about, can China shield Africa from fallout of sanctions against Russia? So Africa has been framed as a pawn which has been moved around by China and Russia. Equally, AP News, and it's really important that the stories that news agencies tell are much more balanced and framed, because news agency content is used quite widely. And you've got an example here from AP News, 12th of March, says Russia foothold in Middle East, Africa raised threats to NATO. So again, Africa is seen as a pawn that is either playing on one side or another. That story was repeated by US News. Business Day, EU-Africa Summit, its implications for China-Africa relations. And then finally, Global Finance, Africa stays neutral in Russia-Ukraine war while bracing for impact. The last one is just inaccurate. It's treating Africa as if it's one nation, whereas, as we know, 54 countries, half of them in the UN resolution backed the resolution against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Others abstained. A few didn't back. So there's a much more nuanced story, but there's a real danger that the foreign powers scramble for Africa can dominate the business story essentially in the next year. And then when we're talking about the free trade agreement, again, this is something that has shocked a number of people. So I thought we'd do an actual real life experiment. So in the last 24 hours, we went onto Google News, put in African Continental Free Trade Area, and saw how many stories came up. And we found 20 stories referencing the free trade area in the last 24 hours. We did this morning. But then when you compare that to the number of articles and stories that reference Africa Business News, there's over 150,000. And so you can see the small proportion that are covering the free trade area, which is incredibly important. Okay, so it's fine to complain. It's fine to talk about the challenges. What are we going to do about it? Well, in the report, which I hope you'll find time to read, we unearthed 35 underreported business opportunities, and below us 6 here. But we know that these 35 are just scratching the surface. So what we got here is that the importance of Africa going forward, and the population growth means that half the world's population growth in the next 2 decades will be from Africa. The dramatically powerful stories about women entrepreneurs leading the world. The story around the insight around when you look at people who are searching globally for the topic of business, the top 10 countries, 8 of them are African countries. When you look at growth of mobile banking, the widest use is in Africa. One of my favorites is around Press Freedom Index. Namibia, Cape Verde, Ghana, South Africa, Burkina Faso, Botswana, all have a higher Press Freedom Index rating than Italy, South Korea, and USA. And then the free trade area is the largest by number of countries. And that's just scratching the surface. So in terms of what storytellers, journalists, consultants, think tanks, communication professionals can do, the report has 21 almost stimulus questions to try and unfreeze storytellers from the potentially biases they have when they're telling stories. So we're asking them to consider these 8 things, and underneath them there are more detailed questions that you can see in the actual report. Ask yourself, when you're doing a story which has a negative frame, we're not saying no story should have any negative frames, but we're just saying the preponderance on them is probably too high. Is there another side to the story which would bring nuance? When you're looking at the sectors you're covering, are you covering tech, finance, primary industries, mining, agriculture? Very understandable. But what about other sectors that may have a new and rich dimensions? What about film? What about art? What about other culture? When you're thinking about the volume of coverage, are you doing enough? Are you doing enough given the dramatic insights we're finding about the growth of entrepreneurial businesses in Africa? Are you doing enough? Are you doing enough coverage of that? When you're thinking about your approach, are you using are you taking an African-centric approach? The protagonists, the experts, the sources, the examples you use, where are they from? Are you broadening the range of countries that you're talking about? Are you talking about some of the stars which appear very high up in international ratings, such as Botswana, Namibia, Seychelles? in terms of the perspectives, are you taking an older man's perspective, or are you trying to search and find the perspective of women and young people? Are you spending a lot of time looking at the kind of the government regulation and dimension? Maybe think about the more private sector dimension, maybe think about startups that have got interesting individual stories to tell. And finally, and incredibly important, what about the free trade area, which is going to have a dramatic effect on the African economies? You don't necessarily have to write positive stories about them, but stories which are starting to open the debate about how the free trade area will develop, maybe in a more equitable way, maybe in a way that individuals and businesses and the citizens can have an impact on how it develops going forward. So that's just a brief overview for those of you who haven't managed to look at the actual report and give you a good sense of the frames that we've talked about. And I'll stop the presentation now.
Thank you so much, Richard, and your insights are really mind-boggling. And before I get into your questions, I would like to first get into our first poll question to our audience. And please let us know, do you think that there is awareness about the African continental free trade area and its impact on the continent? Please give us your feedback. And Richard, this report has unveiled and revealed many things. From your findings, why does international media take a more negative tone about business in Africa than African media?
Well, the first thing is a lack of awareness of their own journalism, and a lack of awareness of the biases and the habits and the patterns that they've gone into. So many of the journalists, not all of them, it's not fair to say that there are, and I should say this is online news media. You have some great example of coverage, of more diverse coverage on TV. On online media, a lot of the journalists and a lot of the storytellers have grown up with certain perspectives around Africa, perspectives that are rooted in poverty, rooted in development, rather than the new perspectives that are more rooted in opportunity, rooted in growth, rooted in business. And so unless they unpack their habits and challenge their own frames, they'll keep writing in the same way.
Agreed. And because frames and stories affect and impact how we think about investing in business in Africa. And we are just about to celebrate the 4th year anniversary of the AFC-FTA agreement. And Bogolo, you are an expert in African matters, politics, and economics, and as an African economist, but most specifically as a former Minister of Trade and Investment, I'm quite curious. Is the AU and other regional bodies doing enough to raise awareness on the importance and impact of the AFC-FTA agreement? And why do you think Africans aren't aware of this agreement?
Thanks, Natasha, and thank you, Richard, for that presentation. So I've generally been a lot being done around the AFCFTA, and I think it's important to also give a little bit of a background here, because the project of this Pan-African unity started in the 50s, the 60s, and it started to be revived in the 90s, and now in the late 2000s, the speed around the AFCFTA really increased, showing the political will around it. Now, if you participate in spaces where governments are and where the AU Commission on Trade is, you will hear a lot about the AFCFTA, to a point where some people were starting to think that there will be fatigue around the AFCFTA. Now, I think what has happened is, as per a lot of government things, they end up just being centered around government and very little being done to engage the private sector and the rest of society. But in the last 2 years, since it came into force. The Secretary General, who was also appointed, has been doing quite a bit of work in trying to sensitize. But let's just also, I think, to give them a little bit of grace in the Secretariat, they were set up just as COVID hit. So even their job in really driving awareness around the AFCFTA got affected by COVID-19. I'll talk a little bit more about it a little later on if you have follow-up, but I just think that there are some other nuances that are key in understanding that governments have been negotiating positions. What is it that will be easier to trade within the continent? And some of the issues were around rules of origin. And if there are still a lot of hanging issues that won't allow trade, it also limits just how much one can talk about it before people start asking, okay, how much has been traded?
Yeah. And just building on that question, and I love one of the comments here by Googletu, and I hope I've not mispronounced your name, is that only those in the know the Free Trade Act, but mainstream doesn't know, meaning the average African is unaware of the impact of this particular agreement. And I think the question then, Bogolo, is this something then for the gentleman's club? Is it a private agreement, for lack of a better word, where Africans are not involved and engaged in the conversation? And then what will impact the narrative of the same, where they don't believe it's going to have a long-term impact and there will not be buy-in? How can we change this narrative?
As I mentioned, I think can you hear me okay? Because I can't.
Yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I think what derailed the message from being spread out to everyone, particularly once it started being implemented, was COVID-19. Again, the Secretariat was set up just before the pandemic hit, and I think that delayed them quite a little bit. But there has been work. To give them some credit, I've been seeing the Secretary General really engaging in a lot of Africa CEO forums and so forth. But most importantly, one of the things that I have seen and I've had the pleasure of participating in is countries are hosting AFCFTA workshops. And UNDP has also partnered with some countries in hosting training workshops to get women SMEs in particular aware of the benefits and impacts of AFCFTA. But I do say this quite cautiously, that it didn't start with the same vigor that was expected because of COVID-19. Now, that doesn't explain why in the media it doesn't have prominence, because we have been writing articles. I know we wrote a couple for foreign policy, the Washington Post, we wrote for CNBC. There are a couple of researchers that have been writing very short, succinct pieces on the AFCFTA for that particular reason, to really make sure that people understand what is going on. I think there is still so much work, so much more work that needs to be done, firstly domestically with countries themselves, to craft what is called accompanying measure strategies. So now there's this trade agreement. What does it mean to businesses? What does it mean to SMEs? How will this simplify cross-border trade? Because at the end of it all, what really matters is, having signed this, does it actually matter for my business? And that is the simplicity and simplifying that we need to do to make sure that it matters for everybody. Similarly, when you talk to people about AGOA in the textile industry, everyone would know it because it had a meaning to their businesses. And I think that is what needs to happen, instead of us singing a song of AFCFTA without really showing what the impacts are.
I really love that, because and I love what you said, is that there's a role to play both domestically, regionally, and just around the continent, by ensuring that we're making this more relevant, that it speaks to our everyday lives. And before I move to the next question, I'd really love to see the results of the question that we asked our audience about awareness around the AFCFTA. Yes, Nazia, thank you. Do you think Yeah. So while the question is up, while we wait for the results, because the results are still streaming in, sorry, I can't seem to see them. I'm going to very quickly just build on that and turn to Yasmin. Yasmin, our usual suspects, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, have historically attracted the lion's share of investment into the continent and have consumed the focus of most media studies and surveys on Africa, and most importantly, have consumed the media. And the challenge with this is that countries that have thriving business industries and economies such as Botswana, Mauritius, Seychelles, and Namibia often end up being invisible. How can we change this and shift the focus to other African countries? And why do you think there's so much focus on what we like to call at ANF the usual suspects?
Right, thank you so much, and really nice to be here. I'd like to share maybe two general thoughts and then also lead up to answering your question. But there's this wonderful quote that Chinua Achebe used to quote very many times, which is, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And I think the beauty of this quote is that you can very much adapt that to news coverage. You can also say that until the lions have their own journalists, the news coverage of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that I think there's a fundamental problem about who is actually telling the stories. And I also read something in the report around how a lot of the news coverage being consumed by Africans is mostly international media instead of our own media. So if that is the case, then we already have a fundamental problem, right? I sit in a lot of CEOs across Africa that we work with. A lot of them have a TV in their office that has CNN running from morning to evening. So if that's what we're consuming, we already have a problem. Where is the Pan-African business news platform where we can tell our own stories? So that's for me one big question that this report has even made more prominent for me. The second thing that I think is a really important and cardinal thought about everything I'm going to answer here today really is, what do we actually have to talk about? I have a slightly different perspective on this trade agreement. I said a session last month, because the office is in Accra and I'm in Accra, about the implementation of this agreement. And as much as I have learned, this agreement is going to take at least another decade to actually have any business impact. So I don't know if we very much have to worry right now about celebrating this and having this more out in the news, because it's not necessarily affecting us in the short or midterm. But you know, there are stories, for instance, what are the businesses that are being built by women, by young people, that are really not being prominently positioned? And I'd also say that goes all the way into traditional businesses. You're saying Nigeria has a lot of coverage, and I agree. But at the same time, the opening of the Dangote's fertilizer plant this week was very much not covered as much as it should have. This is the second largest fertilizer plant in the world. This should have been across the news, especially in Africa. When I speak to people in South Africa or Ghana, most of them haven't heard about it. How did that happen? Okay, so I think there are fundamentally two questions: who is reporting and what are we really talking about that is important to change this continent, right? And when it comes to Nigeria and South Africa and the usual suspects, I totally agree. But again, it's because other people are telling the story. And the Western view to decide what's important is to just look at, okay, where's the GDP the biggest? That in itself will already make you look at Nigeria and South Africa, right? And think that all these sound important. If we can tell our stories and really differentiate our perspective on the geographical diversity of economies across Africa, I think we would already be able to address this problem. And at the same time, also really seeing how we can find the entrepreneurs that are really building things that matter across the continent. A lot of entrepreneurs these days don't think in borders anymore. Our borders are artificial anyway.
Absolutely. Yasmin, I would like to circle back to you speaking about African CEOs tuning into international media. I'm quite curious because we have a lot of African media stations and business stations as well, which they could tune to. Why do you think that they choose not to tune to these African stations and much rather focus on CNN and BBC? Because is it that they trust these stations more? Because there are some African media stations that are telling these stories, but are we seeming to lean more towards the international space? I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts about that before,
Look, I'm also a business person, and I care about understanding how I can grow my business and where I can find opportunities. I'm half German, half Ghanaian. Germany has a bigger GDP than the whole of Africa. So I will definitely also follow international news and not necessarily care about just reading news about one country, because for entrepreneurs that are really looking at international opportunity, you want to understand what's happening around you beyond your borders. And as I said, our borders are artificial anyway, and they make our continent extremely fragmented. So I would very much think that some of the CEOs I'm talking about would probably rather tune into something that is an international Pan-African news platform where they can learn what's happening across the continent. Where is the currency valuing or appreciating? Where are policies changing? Where are new innovations happening that I should know about? Like all of that stuff, right? I don't think that exists. So I'd rather watch CNN Inside Africa or BBC Africa coverage, where I get a more Pan-African view than what I get from local media outlets.
Okay, great. And Richard, just building up on that, what do you think then journalists, think tanks and business schools and other stakeholders need to do to develop balanced frames about business opportunities and trends in Africa? Because the stories are being told, but they're not being told in a balanced way. What factors do we need to consider then?
Well, at a very fundamental level, it's about asking yourself as a storyteller, journalist, think tank, am I going to tell the same stories I've always told? That's the awareness question. If you're going to tell the same stories that you've always told, it's highly likely you'll get the same results. If you want to stand out, if you want to increase the likelihood you're followed by young people, more likely to be followed by entrepreneurial women, more likely to be followed by the leaders of the future, then why not tell different stories that make you stand out, that make you reflect the various different dimensions now? So that's about really fundamentally thinking about, who are my sources? Who are the protagonists in the story? What are the examples I'm using? It's really fundamental, and it's about making your journalism, your storytelling rich and new, rather than the patterns of the old.
I quite like that, especially around patterns and the stories we tell, because a majority of the conversations we hear about Africa is Africa being the next tech hub space, a Silicon Savannah, while we have a booming creative industry that only gets reported 1% in the media. And Yasmin, I'm quite curious about that and your opinions around the fact that we lean more heavily towards talking about Africa as a tech giant as opposed to our booming Nollywood industry and the fact that Afrobeats is taking over the world. Everyone, including Justin Bieber, wants to collaborate with our African superstars, but we're not talking about these stories in the media and how they actually affect the economy in a very positive way and their impact on businesses. And how can we begin thinking differently about the creative industry as a business opportunity for Africans? Yasmin, I don't know if you could hear me.
Natasha, I just had a network issue. I didn't hear your question. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
could you repeat it?
No apologies needed. The question was around creative industries and how they can be part of government strategies around business in Africa. And yeah, how we can make these conversations more prominent, not just in the media, but around Africans as well.
Yeah. Look, I mean, apart from what I already mentioned, I think there are definitely industries that are also not represented as much in the average African's awareness. Like, for instance, creative industry. A lot of friends in the African industry that are creatives, right? And they are often struggling to even still be respected at home because they went into a creative job. Unfortunately, that's sadly still reality in many situations, right? So again, I think change starts with self. We also need to think about what are the narratives that we want to write and how do we want to appreciate the different diversity of industry and economy better. Having said that, I think I also observed that there are entrepreneurs, and I'd argue especially in the non-tech space, that maybe don't appreciate PR and reputation management as much. I mean, we work for some African businesses who do incredible things. They don't even have anyone taking care of their PR. They don't issue any press releases when they enter a new plant. They don't do it. And the same thing for creatives. I mean, they do amazing work, but how much they talk about it is a different question, right? So I think there's also something around making sure that the African entrepreneur thinks more about the business case behind PR and talking about your work. Unfortunately, in some cases, depending on what kind of sector you're in, people might even say that it's a business case not to be seen, right? We have clients like this that really say, look, if we are out there, we're going to have more competitive trouble, especially with foreign multinationals that are going to start seeing what we're doing and are going to try and give us trouble. So that's of course also reality, right? But in general, I really think that it's important to drive the momentum more when it comes to encouraging African entrepreneurs across industries to really tell their own story and be aware that it is also part of your responsibility if you do something great to empower others with it in case of just being in your microcosm. So that's what I would say to that. And of course, if we have that Pan-African news platform that I was talking about, then we could also make sure that that platform has a much more diverse agenda. So that's how I see it.
I really love what you talked about around PR and reputation management, because do you think that could also be something we look into when it comes to even speaking about the AfCFTA agreement, where we are actually being very intentional about ensuring that it is understood and the impact of the agreement is actually internalized by Africans? You work with African businesses and you're helping them build incredible brands. Aside from the creative industry, what do you think some of the challenges that African businesses face when it comes to ensuring that there's conversation around the important things that they're doing? Because oftentimes we tend to speak about the challenges, but not the opportunities around the businesses on the continent. How can we shift that conversation and focus, even internally amongst ourselves, and how businesses project and talk about their work?
No, I love that you're mentioning that, and it's actually something we often talk about, because we also think that there is a little bit of a lack of focus on opportunities by some of the businesses we work with, at least. Often there's about, okay, you know, I don't know, let's stick with Dangote, for instance. Of course, Dangote is a huge business, right? And it's a huge business. But the business is cement. That's a very basic opportunity. There are a lot of companies that go into the vast opportunity of just offering basic products and services that are not sufficiently provided in Africa, but don't necessarily think so much about what's next. Like, what are the big opportunities out there? Also, we like talking about what are the global opportunities that are out there, because I always say that the only way that we can ever close the job creation gap that we currently have, which is about 6x, really scary, by the way, is to actually think about how can an African company grow into a business that can like employ 100,000 people, just that one business, right? That would be a significant shift in job creation. So I think there are often businesses where we don't always see that level of thinking is happening, right? How can I think beyond my own borders? How can I think beyond my current products and services? And I think because of that, you sometimes also don't see as many stories about that, because businesses think that way. However, there are exceptions. There are exceptions where companies are really moving the needle and are still not being seen. And I think for those, I would just really love to see that there are more on-the-ground news anchors as well that find these stories. I mean, we also get some news coverage, right? But often it's people contacting us that are not even in Africa.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
These companies I'm talking about, they're really what you'd call a hidden champion. And if you're not around, you will not find them and you won't be able to tell their story, even if they maybe do a bit of press work or publish a press release here and there. So for me, there's a question around how can you have more business news anchors on the ground that are looking for these stories? I think when it comes to politics, I see more anchors that are on the ground and reporting what's happening in Africa. But for business news, I always get surprised how many people are writing about African business and are actually not here. So how are you going to find these innovators? It's going to be very difficult unless they really put themselves out there like the tech entrepreneurs.
Yeah, thank you. And I will come back to that because I have a question for Richard. But Bogolo, you are the youngest minister to ever be appointed on the the continent, and you're a young woman and a young businesswoman, and we still see that young women and the youth are extremely underrepresented in the media, and mostly when the focus and conversations around them are had, it's around giving them a leg up and not necessarily about the amazing things they're doing on the continent. Number one, why do you think this is? And number two, how can we change this? How can we ensure that we are amplifying the amazing work that young people are doing on the continent, and women as well? How can we ensure that they are no longer underrepresented and misrepresented in the media?
Thanks, Natasha. But first, I think I think we shouldn't leave the conversation around the AFCFTA in that it would take 10 years before anything happens. Okay. Because I think it is having a conversation at that point that would then also cause lethargy around the AFCFTA itself.
Yeah.
I say this because there is so much work that is currently being done to operationalize the agreement to a point that there is a future report that I would recommend everyone to check out that highlights the value chains that can start attracting investment around the AFCFTA, given the analysis that has been done on, I'm trying to bring it up, but given the analysis that has already been done in terms of tariffs that have been agreed. If you look at the rules of origin, what has already been agreed around rules of origin, it's already at 85%, which basically means that there is already quite a bit of traction and things that we have agreed on. And so there are about 6 right now value chains that UNDP has worked with the AFCFTA Secretariat, highlighting those sectors where investment can start being attracted, working on beneficiation of minerals, working on agriculture, working on batteries and so forth. There are a couple of them, and I think that work needs to be highlighted to show that when there is trade facilitation in those spaces, when there's investment attraction in those spaces, then we can start really operationalizing the AFCFTA and it mattering to everybody else and not seeming like it's a closed club. And one of the reasons why the work around regionalization died in the first place is because people didn't believe in it. So if we do not believe in it ourselves, then it really won't take off. And I just want us to make sure that even that narrative in platforms like this is also addressed. And then just to go back to your question around women and young people, again, it's about who speaks to these particular issues. You know, the amazing young women in literature, the amazing women in art, and you need to use your voice and your platform to amplify such work. We cannot always expect for CNN and everybody else to be the one to give us that platform when we are the ones that know the work that is being done. We need to first ensure, given the space that I work in, I always say first we need to ensure that there is capital and investments going to women and to young people, and then we can have representation that encourages more to do to come up to the fold in terms of arts or whatever sector it is that they are in. But it's all about the platform being given. It's all about the capital following the ambitions that we have and making sure that we are not just hosting tea parties in a corner and not really sharing those experiences. One of the things, well, we're talking about women, and I just want to highlight women in art. You know, Mam Pumzile, when she was the head of UN Women, I mean, she made such a concerted effort in the space that she was in internationally to highlight women in art in Africa, you know, and took an exhibition working with other women in South Africa to New York to highlight such work. And it is about using our platforms individually and collectively to make sure that we are highlighting some of these issues. Now, if we talk about women's participation in the economy, that's a whole different ballpoint. And I'd want to address policies that are still restrictive to women owning land, owning opening bank accounts, because if there's any restriction to women's participation in the economy, whether legislatively or by strategy, then we will see a very limited participation of women in the economy, effective participation and agency.
Yeah, and speaking about participation, I'm really glad Yasmin is on the call, because one, she's a businesswoman, but two, she works with African businesses. And I'm quite keen, Yasmin, for you to give us feedback on what Bogolo spoke about, especially about the fact that we can implement the agreement now. There's room for it now and not 10 years in the future. So, because you're working with several African businesses, what are your thoughts, initial thoughts on Bogolo's comments around, the value chains that exist now and the work that needs to be done to facilitate conversation now?
Well, I mean, look, of course we can have the conversation now, but I think at the moment the Secretariat itself actually doesn't communicate that much, and people are in the dark, and that's also then difficult for this platform to fix if there's just not enough information. And I also think that there's a limit to what we can do as private sector people. We can, of course, demand for it to be implemented faster, but I was just also mentioning that in the chat. At the moment in ECOWAS, for instance, there are a lot of countries that have actually closed their borders because of COVID. And I was sitting in the session with two people from the Secretariat not too long ago, and they were talking about how that's even further down the ability to implement anything. Plus, you actually have to really change the entire protocol around how border controls work, how customs are set up, and all of that. It's just a lot of work. I'm not saying this as out of cynicism that the trade agreement is not credible. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that I'm not sure we are there yet to celebrate the success, because we are still at the beginning of the journey. And there's so much else that is happening in Africa that is being underreported on, when it comes to business opportunities, things people are building, things that are investable, opportunities for collaboration and partnerships and Pan-African company growth that are, for me, more tangible now that I'm not seeing. And if you ask me, okay, between those two things, what would I try and really course correct immediately? I would say it's things that are already being implemented that we're not seeing, as opposed to something that is yet to be fully implemented. That's what I'm saying. Just correct that, right?
I don't want to create a debate. Sorry, Yasmin. I just don't think those two are mutually exclusive. They are not. And I just don't want us to have a conversation where it's one or the other. We can highlight the work that currently exists that is brilliant in a corner, and use that to support why there should be heightened work around the AFCFTA, because it can support those to have a bigger market. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I hear you both saying is actually that though there's a lot more work to be done, there's still room to actually ensure that we are feeling the benefits now of the agreement. And there's space to actually give more room for implementation and ensure that the value chains are being implemented effectively. And Bogolo, I want us to shift. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, just to build on the points that have been made. In terms of the communication, Yasmin made a really powerful point about the PR and communication. I think when you think about this report and what it's about narratives. It's not about the work that's being done. We're assuming a lot of work's being done. It's about the stories you tell about the work that's being done. And certainly certainly when you think about an individual business, have what in your business plan, what's your communications, what's your PR, because that can amplify the impacts of your business. Is a really massive point that Yasmin made. And then when you apply that to the AFCFTA, it's equally as important. The communication strategy, we'd argue in this report, needs to be ramped up dramatically. Now, there were real challenges around COVID, and everyone needs to accept that. But when you, in the report, you'll see that the research we saw of businesses, not just the publics, but of businesses in Ghana, Nigeria, in East Africa, the awareness was incredibly low. And that will stay low unless there's been a step change in the communications. And finally, there was a really great question in the Q&A around, to what extent is the power of media really being embraced and understood? Because if it's really being embraced and understood, then we're in a different zone. Currently, the story about African business is dominated to extent of 80% by external storytellers.
Exactly. And not just external storytellers. The major conversation around business in Africa is around foreign powers and foreign investors, the US, Russia, the UK. These are most of the conversations that when we talk about business in Africa. And I'm quite curious, Yasmin, how can we shift this and give focus to African entrepreneurs and businesses and not to Western influence on what we are doing? Is there room for that conversation, or is there too much influence when it comes to foreign powers that it's quite difficult to isolate and focus on the amazing things that we're doing on the continent? Yasmin?
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, my power went off and I'm on generator. All right. So I think that the Scramble for Africa, which is also part of the title of the webinar, is obviously real, and it's unfortunately still happening. And I currently talk a lot about that as well when it comes to like the tech investment space, right? Because we're seeing all these big deals being celebrated where US American funds are buying large shares of some of our best tech companies. And as much as the capital inflow is great, it also means that we lose control over these businesses as Africans, right? And I don't think that's being thought about. Currently, if you look at the capital flows and where businesses are really getting money from, I mean, it's just a lot of money that comes from Western and Eastern global powers, and not necessarily from within Africa. So again, I think, you know, of course, what story we are telling also depends on what's actually happening. And I think that it's very important to correct some of these things because we want to actually build our own story, and we don't want to extend the narratives that have been built during colonial times. I think that's something that every entrepreneur actually needs to be a lot more aware of, because as soon as you build a business and you start hiring people, you actually start having signaling power, and you have storytelling power that you can decide to use or not to use. And what you do, we become a role model for what other people do. So I think that there's something around just essentially rethinking how this whole thing works all together. But apart from that, I'd also just love to see a lot more like of the counter story. I mean, yes, there is a lot of coverage out there. Oh, China and Africa, and how is that going to reduce the power of the Western Africa, blah, blah, blah. Where are the stories where we're saying, how is Africa going to take over the world? What is our agenda when it comes to taking over a market like Germany? Like we work with one company, for example, that's very exciting, who's currently just now acquired a huge plant in Germany, right? And nobody knows about that. But they are now in their sector literally starting to take over some of the German market. I love that story.
Wow, I love it too.
Right? Okay, how are we also scrambling for global relevance by going outside of Africa and showing that we are able to play that game? I think right now it's very one-sided, and the stories are there, but we need to find them and amplify them because they're really important in order to redefine how we feel and think about ourselves as Africans. Our relevance isn't just limited to the continent, it's global relevance.
And just building on that, because a lot of, especially around tech entrepreneurship, a lot of tech entrepreneurs in Africa feel they've made it when they get foreign investment. Is there a way we can change that to ensure that even local and regional investment has an impact on their businesses? Or and is it there where we could rethink about investing within the continent and not necessarily looking for a saving grace outside? Hence ensuring that a majority of tech companies in Africa are African on the face of it, but when you lift the veil, they really aren't.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And I mean, I think there's so much to be said about the whole question of how you can actually start blending the traditional business sector with the tech business sector. One thing that I currently worry about is trying to build a separate world of tech that is not really integrating into all the businesses that we already have. There are so many opportunities to actually bring the two together, but that's for a different day. I think when it comes to the point you just made, I mean, obviously there's a shortage of capital in Africa. I won't agree with that, right? As soon as you get beyond, let's say, Series B, it's kind of difficult to actually find that amount of capital without going abroad. And that's something that has to be fixed. Where are the billionaires and big entrepreneurs in Africa that are actually willing to put some of their money into funds to fund these businesses, as opposed to putting it into real estate in London or something, right?
Yeah.
So that's something to make sure happens, right? We need to strengthen the capital flow that is from African entrepreneurs and other financiers into other African entrepreneurs. But I also think that there's a big point about long-term thinking that I think is even very applicable to the whole having here. I think, I personally think that short-term thinking is the biggest threat to any business, no matter if it's in Africa or elsewhere, right? And the whole thing around PR and storytelling usually doesn't pay off in the long term, in the short term, right? If you publish an article today or publish a press release today that you open a plant, maybe 10 people will read it and you'll be like, oh wow, what was the benefit of that?
Yeah.
Keep doing it consistently over time in the longer term, it will actually pay off to build your profile, relevance, and help changing narratives eventually. I think with the whole situation around tech investments right now, it's a bit of the same thing. I mean, the short term is basically like, okay, if I go to the US, I'll get twice as much valuation, and I sit on more value as a founder. But what's going to happen in the long term? In the long term, your business might get down price later on because you weren't able to deliver the financials that people were expecting or whatever, right? So I think that there's about how much long-term thinking are we applying as entrepreneurs, and what does that imply for decision making today, no matter if it's for fundraising or for storytelling.
Long-term thinking for entrepreneurs, and just even for African businessmen, this is an opportunity for you to invest on the continent and not just in big malls, foreign properties abroad, but invest in tech entrepreneurs. Bogolo, just speaking about investment, we find a majority of the conversations around the media is focused heavily on government and policies and not on entrepreneurs. And that seems quite problematic. Are we too heavily reliant on government to a point where there's no enabling environment for businesses and investors to thrive without sort of relying heavily on, are we gaining favor from government and getting government opportunities to thrive? You've been in this space, not just as an economist, but as a government official, and I'm quite keen to hear your thoughts, and if at all there are any solutions for this particular challenge that we're facing.
Right, thanks. I think one of the reasons why there's such a big focus on African governments, even in business, is because of the impact that governments have in our economies. And one in that, they have the role of creating an enabling environment. And there's a challenge for most governments to do policy reform. You know, when there used to be this doing business report, it became such a key intel tool for how businesses would do and how investment would perform in those countries. And I think that is why there's that main focus on governments. But secondly, many economies in the continent are heavily reliant on government expenditure and on government behavior. And so when you have a little bit of visibility into how a government would operate, on what their priorities are, it can even give you a little bit of insight on how business is going to perform, or which sector is going to be of a priority to a particular government. I mean, even in 2020, when UNCTAD reported that there would be about a 15% reduction of FDI into the continent, the main issue was, during a crisis, would African governments be able to continue securing and protecting foreign investments, in particular, Western investments in the continent. So I think that is really why that is a big issue, and why there's such a big focus on African governments. I obviously like to challenge that, because the private sector continuously shows. There's a lot of feedback on your side, Natasha, or somebody.
Oh, sorry.
The mic is on. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I was saying I really like challenging that, because sometimes the key indicator for how an economy is, or most times, or how an economy is performing, or the opportunities that exist, is about the growth of the private sector. So you have a look at the private sector that sometimes really thrives during difficult periods. Jack Ma used to say, if the Chinese government was aware of the internet economy in 99, when he started Alibaba, he potentially wouldn't have started Alibaba, because the regulatory environment would have become a lot more stringent as it is now, and it would have potentially been more prohibitive to doing business than not. So it's not necessarily that the way government operates is indicative of the business opportunities, but that is just how it has been positioned in the African continent, because of the governance issues that we've had in the past.
And what will it take for governments, especially African governments, to embrace private sector involvement? What do you think it will take for us to move in the direction where the conversations involve more private sector as opposed to government involvement when it comes even to infrastructure development?
So I'm struggling a bit, because the sun has fully found me in the office, and I think I need to do something about this. Sorry, your question was, what do governments need to do to embrace the private sector better?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would like to say that it's a wish to say that it's every government's, it's important for every government to prioritize private sector, because governments shouldn't be in the business of doing business, but should be in the business of facilitating businesses. So they should be there to really empower the private sector, and to find out what the needs are, in order for the economies to thrive, in order for there to be inclusive growth, because a government can only set its targets, its goals of reducing employment, reducing unemployment, inequalities, and so forth. But it is not for the government to create those jobs, it's to facilitate the private sector. So for me, it should be an ordinary space that governments love private sector, because that's how they are going to achieve the growth that they want, and to achieve the goals that they have set. But we have seen that it is a little different across the continent, and I wish we had a little bit more time for me to go into the details of some of the negotiations and how they go. But it varies with what the priorities of a certain government are, and you tend to see it being skewed in even the sectors that they choose to support.
Yeah, and just building on that, Yasmin, because you work in the space with African businesses, do you think that governments are giving room for public sector involvement, or is it still a push and pull struggle?
So I'd like to also offer the perspective. I mean, everything in life is a two-way street, right? And we host a conference through my company once a year called Africa at Scale, where we talk about how businesses can rethink their growth ambitions and look for alternative expansion pathways that can create more jobs. And 2 years ago, we had Obi Ezekwesili at the conference, who used to be the Vice President for Africa at the World Bank, and then also candidated as President for Nigeria. And I'll never forget the speech, and it's quite relevant to this conversation, because she called me the previous evening and said, Yasmin, I can talk about anything I'd like to, right? And I was like, yeah, sure, I trust you. And then she started her speech and started ranting, and was like, oh, you lazy business people who are sitting here talking about expansion opportunities for Africans, pretending that you don't have to engage with politics, shame on you, basically. So the point of her speech in the end was very powerful. She said to us, look, if you think that you can actually build a business and be successful without government support, you're probably really not thinking about it hard enough, because depending on how government policy evolves, your business can literally be shut down like this in a day. Absolutely. And it's really, really important to try and connect with governments, even if maybe in some places in Africa it's not that easy. And her point was that we need to see a lot more unification of the private sector across Africa, really, not just in one country, but really saying, okay, how can you build a platform for African businesses across the continent to unite and have stronger lobbying power, really, in order to drive their agenda with governments more comprehensively, and also start having access to more capital, because it's just not like 10 businesses, it will be like thousands of businesses, right? And I thought that was a very powerful point that she made that I've never forgotten ever since, because you know, often there are businesses, unless they are directly into government business, that also very much try to avoid the government agenda because they feel it might be bad for them. But I think that's not necessarily the way to go.
I agree fully, and I really, I love what you shared around the same. I would like to very quickly go to our poll results before we begin winding down the conversation. So the question is, do you think there is awareness around the AFCFTA agreement? And 89% of our audience members said no, and only 11% said yes. The second question we asked our audience was, are smaller African states given as much attention? And a resounding 94% said no. There's a lot more work that needs to be done when we have conversations around the FTA agreement. The next question was, do you know much about the AFCFTA agreement? And 84% of our audience members said no. There's a lot more room for this conversation to be had. And we have seen the impact of stories when it comes to thinking about investment, not just around government policies, but about the narratives we have about business in Africa, and the impact of these narratives when it comes to not just investing, but even us as Africans thinking about getting into business, and how this affects how we understand not just the agreement, but the existing space for opportunities. I want to thank my distinguished panelists, Bogolo, Kenewendo, Yasmin Kumi, and the author of our report, Richard Addy. Thank you so much for the time that you've taken to be with us. We thank our audience for the opportunity to engage with us. You could have been anywhere, but you chose to be with us today. Thank you so much. All the way from Nairobi, Kenya. Have a lovely evening. Thank you once again, everybody. Thank you so much.